It's good afternoon from Hong Kong, and I know I'm really excited that this afternoon we're going to have another book program for you by somebody who is a longtime China observer, and we're really delighted that our friend Nellie Fang introduced us to Dori Jones Yang to talk about her new book. It's a memoir, When the Red Gates Open, about her journey, as a young woman into China in the 80s. So I'm really delighted that we can have this opportunity to welcome Dori from Seattle to join us. She is author of many books, and in fact, I encourage you to get on her website to look at the other books she's published, including, and really, I'm also very interested in the Starbucks book and about the Starbucks journey, pouring your heart into it. So we're really delighted also to welcome back our friend Ying Chen. Professor Ying Chen is with the founding director of the Hong Kong Youth Media or Journalism School over 2 decades ago, I believe. So Ying is really also a longtime friend of Asia Society Hong Kong, and Ying is going to help us do the moderation for this afternoon's program. And I think the book is also available on Amazon, and in fact, I'm going to highly recommend it to those of you who belong to a book club. Books have helped us through this global pandemic, and I'm reading more books now than ever, and I'm looking forward to picking up Dori's book and to learn about her journey. But I think it's really important for me this week. The program we've done this week have been about storytelling. Yesterday we heard about resiliency, and later on this week, on the 4th, we're going to hear from 2 women diplomats to talk about the Abraham Accords. So I think it's really important that we pass on stories so the next generation can learn about our journeys. And so I'm really, again, thank you, Dori, for joining us, and thank Ying for moderation. And I'm going to turn it over to Ying Chen. Ying can learn about our journeys. And so I'm really, again, thank you, Dori, for joining us, and thank Ying for moderation. And I'm going to turn it over to Ying Chen.
Hi, am I on?
Yes, you are on.
Oh, hello. Welcome. It's great to meet Dori online, and I'm looking forward to your hearing you talk about your book.
Can learn about our journeys. And so I'm really, again, thank you, Dori, for joining us, and thank Ying.
Hello.
Yes. So thanks very much, Ying. I really appreciate the welcome, and it's wonderful to be back in Hong Kong, even though I'm in Seattle. I miss Hong Kong very badly. I had planned a trip there in April of last year and wasn't able to come, so I'm hoping to plan a trip again soon. I love interacting with audiences with questions, so I hope that as I speak, you'll come up with some great questions. I think Ying has some really good questions as well. But because some of you don't know me and don't know about the book, I wanted to start with a presentation where I could give you a little bit of background about the book. So I'm going to share screen now, and hope that you can see the screen. You see what I'm seeing? The book is called, as Alice said, When the Red Gates Opened, a memoir of China's reawakening. It was just published a few months ago. And it's both a personal and historical memoir. So it weaves in the personal with the historical. It takes place in 1982 to 1990, when I was Business Week's correspondent in Hong Kong, covering Hong Kong and China. So it's both it's an individual story set in China and Hong Kong during what turned out to be a really pivotal era, which was the 1980s. I think that the farther we get from it, the more we can see clearly just how important that time period was, when Deng Xiaoping really began the major changes that have allowed China to modernize and become prosperous the way it is today. One other thing about the book is that I'm based here in Seattle. I've been living here since I left Hong Kong. And I wrote it essentially to give some insights into China for American readers from an American reporter who really tried to understand China from the inside. And I do think, and maybe we can get into this a little later, that there are a lot of misunderstandings that Americans have about China. And a lot of Americans are very ignorant about China, don't know much about it, might not ever pick up a heavy-duty historical academic tome about China, but might be very interested in a personal story where they could learn about China and about that particular period of Chinese history through my own personal experiences. So my story really begins in January of '79, when the US and China reestablished diplomatic relations. And as many of you remember, the leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, came to the US for a tour of several cities, including Washington, D.C., where he met with our president, Jimmy Carter, to sign the papers to begin the normalization process. And there was also a major, Carter welcomed him with a gala performance at the Kennedy Center in Washington. And I was there in the back row. I was a graduate student living in Washington at that time. And it was just a magical moment, just a kind of a moment really ripe with hope. Throughout my childhood, the US and China had been hostile to each other. And then suddenly things were shifting very rapidly. And with that establishment of diplomatic relations, relations between the US and China suddenly were very friendly and started to be very positive. And so who am I and what's my background and how did I end up in that backseat at the Kennedy Center? My background includes a background in journalism. I grew up in Ohio. My dad had a bookstore. And so I was interested in reading and writing from very early days. And at his encouragement, I got my first job in journalism at age 18 when I was just going into college, and worked for my hometown newspaper. And then at Princeton, I worked on the student newspaper, the Daily Princetonian. So that's sort of where I had gotten my early training in journalism. But I also had developed a background in China. I didn't have a background in the beginning. I grew up in a place where there were no Chinese people and no one spoke Chinese in this town where I lived. And but after I graduated from college, I spent 2 years in Singapore at Nanyang University and studied Mandarin Chinese and taught English there. It was my instruction in Chinese was 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, which turns out to be the best way for someone like me to really just get immersed in the Chinese language. I fell in love with the language, just loved learning Chinese and speaking Chinese. But I realized I didn't know much about China. This was back in the 70s, when American citizens were very limited in terms of ability to travel in China. And so very few Americans had ever even been there. So I came back and I studied about China in a graduate program at Johns Hopkins studied international economics and China studies so that I would be able to understand the country a little bit better as well. And I also have a business perspective. My dad was a small business owner, and also when I was a graduate student, I worked for the U.S.-China Business Council in Washington, D.C., and they have a magazine called the China Business Review. So I was just starting to combine my interest in China with my interest in journalism and my interest in business, and they were all kind of coming together. And when I graduated, it was right after U.S. and China had established diplomatic relations. So suddenly, major American newspapers and magazines were very, very interested in hiring journalists who had some kind of background about China. And I applied to several of them, and the one that hired me was Business Week. And they moved me to New York and trained me up. And then in 1982, they sent me to Hong Kong to be the bureau chief. A bureau chief sounds like a high-level position, but it was a one-person bureau. There was nobody there to help me except the first few weeks. And I was in charge of covering all of China, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, and also all of Southeast Asia, with some freelancers. So it was really kind of an impossibly big job for a 28-year-old, but I was kind of undaunted. China in 1982, some of you remember, some of you perhaps are too young to remember, but it was just beginning the very earliest stages of the transformation under Deng Xiaoping. So it was still about 90% of the people were still in poverty. Everyone still rode bicycles to work or took the bus. There were not any private cars at all. There were still there were still slogans on the street. They weren't quite as political as they'd been before. There were still statues of Chairman Mao. But there were also the first signs of the changes under Deng. And that included, as those of you who know about the early stages will remember, the first reforms started in the agricultural sector, and farmers were able to plant what they wanted to plant instead of what the government told them. And then they were able to bring their produce into the cities and sell it in free markets without being criticized as capitalists. They were allowed to do small scale business. And I started writing stories. I visited China very shortly after coming to Hong Kong. And then throughout the 80s, went back and forth into many different parts of China and many different cities, and covered U.S. business and U.S. investment and U.S. trade in China. And throughout that time, there was really kind of a push and pull. There would be sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And the American businesses were very enthusiastic, but it was also a difficult time to do business in China. You couldn't even make an international phone call unless you booked it in advance, and people were still using telexes and faxes. So many of my stories during that time were about this sort of push and pull, 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. Of course, a very big story at the time also was the future of Hong Kong. Just a few months after I arrived in Hong Kong, Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Britain, went to Beijing to meet with Deng Xiaoping and other leaders to begin the talks about Hong Kong's future after the lease expired in 1997. And at the time, it set off kind of a panic in Hong Kong. A lot of people were trying to find a way to leave. A lot of the people who were living in Hong Kong had been born in China and didn't trust the government there, and were very worried about what the future might hold. So that was a major story for me. My first cover story was called The Future of Hong Kong. It was about those issues I just talked about, but it also happened to be right at the time when Hong Kong Shanghai Bank just built its brand new headquarters, which is very familiar to all of you, and the Bank of China wanted to build a taller one with an even more impressive architect. They had I.M. Pei come. So it was a very visible symbol right in the heart of Hong Kong of the rivalry, in a way, between business, British and other interests, and Chinese interests. And so I used that as the centerpiece for that story. About a year after I arrived, I met a good-looking Chinese guy named Paul Yang, and started seeing him, later married him, and our daughter was born in Hong Kong at Hong Kong Adventist Hospital about 5 or 6 years later. Anyway, when I first met him, he told me that about his background, which is the kind of background that's probably familiar to many of you. He was born in mainland China before 1949, and his father was with the Kuomintang. So his family moved to Taiwan in 1949, and he went to high school and college in Taiwan. And then he went to the US in the 60s for graduate school. So he had been a US citizen for more than 10 years by the time I met him. So he's very Americanized. And less than a month after I met him, believe it or not, we went to Taiwan together, and I got to meet his parents, who were still living in Taiwan at that time. And it was really a wonderful experience for me. My Chinese was good enough that I was able to communicate with them. They didn't speak any English, and was able to kind of see the world through their eyes. And it really got me started on this whole idea that in order to really understand China, it was really important for me to get to know individual Chinese on a personal basis, in addition to all the interviews and high-level people I was talking to talk to ordinary people. And that happened quite a bit in the 80s because, as some of you remember, that was a time when people like Paul, who had been living in Taiwan or overseas, for the first time were able to reconnect with their relatives inside China. And he had lost touch with them completely for 30 years. And he reestablished connections. And the picture on the lower left of me with the funny fox fur hat, I'm talking to an uncle of Paul's, and his mother's family came from a farming village in Hubei province. And it was at that time a very poor, very typical, very poor village with dirt floors and very simple life that people lived there. And I was able to really get off the beaten track. It was not a place that I would have gone as a journalist, and talk to local people and understand what life looked like for them. And also the two pictures on the right, we went to see he had an elder sister who's about 15 years older, who had been left behind in China when the rest of the family went to Taiwan. And she had had a very bitter life, as you can imagine, because her father was with the Kuomintang. And but when he reconnected with her, he helped her to build a house, gave her enough money that she could build a nice house and get her son back from the countryside. And I was able, through getting to know her, to really see how important it was what Deng Xiaoping was doing in China. This wasn't just some business story I was writing for a magazine. It was something that affected so many individuals personally, and gave a hope that things could get better and that people would have more personal freedoms and more control over their lives. And that really helped me to see China from the inside. In 1985, I wrote a cover story called Capitalism in China. And it was really kind of the high tide of a very exciting decade, just full of hope and optimism and really euphoria even. I got accused of writing too euphoric of an article, because it was a time when ordinary people didn't have to dress in drab clothing. They could wear bright red hats and rabbit fur coats, and had access to the trappings, at least, of a better life. And also some of them could go into business for themselves. Many people were. And there was just a lot more choice. You didn't have to stay with the same job all your life. People could choose what kind of work that they wanted to do. And at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party, of course, is still in charge, and they had certain suspicions about foreign journalists, which they do to this day, as you know. And at that time, it was impossible, was not allowed for foreign journalists to go around the country and arrange their own interviews and just talk to people as a journalist. every time I made a trip for a Business Week story, I had to have it organized by something called the All China Journalists Association, which was supposedly non-governmental. But of course, I knew that they would send a minder around with me who would not only make arrangements for me, but could serve as an interpreter if I needed. And but I was very lucky, because although I knew very much that after each day was over, that she would be writing up a report and sending it to the powers that be to say who this reporter was and what she was asking and what she was writing about. But I was lucky because the first minder that I had was a young woman about the same age as myself named Tiananmen. And we got to know each other pretty well, and we became friendly. And it was very clear we were on different teams. I was on Team America and she was on Team China, but that didn't mean we couldn't be friends. And I was lucky in a way because I was a business reporter. I wasn't covering politics or human rights. That just wasn't part of what I was assigned to cover. So the issues I was covering were not as sensitive as some other reporters, but so that made it a little bit easier. But I ended up with a very nice relationship with her. Some people have asked me who my favorite interview was when I was in China in the 80s, and it's hard to just pick out one, but this man, Professor Li Yining, is probably familiar to some of you. He's a Beida professor, and they called him Mr. Stock Market because he was the one who came up with the idea that China's state-owned companies should convert to privately held companies and sell stock. And I remember the first time I read about that, I just thought that was impossible. And there'd never in the world been a communist country that allowed for a stock market. And today that seems so quaint to even think that. But at the time it was shocking. It was really amazing. And this man was bold enough to have the vision to imagine that and encourage it. So just moving ahead in the 90s, the biggest story that I covered was the protests in Tiananmen Square in May of 1989. Some people, at least in America, don't remember that there were 6 weeks of protests that were completely peaceful. And there were no soldiers, no policemen, but there was no looting, no destruction, no vandalism. It was an amazing, it was actually a really exhilarating story to cover, because although there was discontent, which is the reason that the protests had started, there was also really amazing openness and a sense of freedom and hope. And people were just, in earlier years, people had been hesitant to talk to me as a foreign journalist. And in those days, they were just opening their mouths and talking to everybody. And it was such a transformation, and it was a very exciting thing to cover. But of course, as you all know, it ended with despair. 6 weeks later, when the People's Liberation Army came in to crush the remaining protests, they used live ammunition, and it sent me into despair. It sent a lot of people into despair. And we ran this cover story called The Great Leap Backward. It really felt at the time that China was done. All this exciting openness and positivity and capitalist experimentation was over, and China would be going back into the past. So at the time, I didn't want to get my contacts in trouble, even as a journalist. It was hard to go back into China. I didn't know who I should contact. So I just decided it was time to go back to the United States. So that's when I moved back to the US, was in 1990. But as you know, those of us who thought that everything was over in China and that China would be moving backward were wrong. We're dead wrong. And you all know the story of what happened after that. In 92, Deng Xiaoping came forward and said, no, we've got to keep the reforms going, and we've got to keep opening up to trade and investment. And he did, and he enforced that, and his successors continued that. And this is a bit of an old chart, but I think it's kind of interesting, the growth in GDP per capita of China, which is the red line, compared to India, which is the green line. And you can see that during the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was China and India were basically the same. They were both very poor. And then China pulled far, far ahead. And of course, as you know, the GDP per capita has gone up to 10,000 US dollars since then. The triangles on the right, I think, are very interesting. They actually come from a talk by Professor Graham Allison of Harvard. And he talks about how in 1978, when Deng began the reforms, so roughly 90% of Chinese people were below the extreme poverty line. And as you all know, that the number below the extreme poverty line has actually fallen to zero as of this year or as of last year. So that is just unheard of in all of history. In any other country, no other country has done anything remotely like that. And it certainly wasn't what we were expecting in 1989. This chart, the blue line, this shows the attitudes of American citizens toward China. The blue line is those who have an unfavorable view of China. The green line is people who have a favorable view. And as you can see, over the last 15 years, the number of people in the US with an unfavorable view of China has gone from just 30% or so up to 73%. And it may even be higher by now. This is from last summer. So this is the world that my book has come out into. I actually started writing the book 4 or 5 years ago when it was still about 50-50. And now the percentage of people in America who have a negative view is very, very high. And that there are good reasons for that. It also makes me very sad. And that's something that I'm hoping that this book will really help Americans to understand and appreciate the Chinese people, beyond even the Chinese government. So just a few conclusions and themes. One is that I really think the 1980s were very pivotal in the history of China and communism and the whole world. I mean, this was an unthinkable, amazing transformation that started in the 80s. And it was very bold of Deng Xiaoping, and it wasn't easy. And there were a lot of hurdles to overcome to even start on that path. So it's an important time. Secondly, journalist predictions are often wrong. You have to be very humble when you're a journalist, because there's written evidence of your lack of foresight. So if you say the great leap backward, and people can look back on that and they know that your predictions are wrong. So even today, when you read predictions in the papers, just remember journalists are not always right. And also China looks very different from the inside. I found as an American journalist, it was really hard to convey this full nuance and complexity, really almost impossible because China is so complex. But I really think it's important for Americans especially to try to see the world through China's eyes and just try to understand the difference in values and the difference in perspective, and also the historical perspective. There have been a lot of ups and downs in US-China relations. It's interesting to me that Americans are just passionate about China. They're either passionately in love with China or they hate it passionately. I mean, the pendulum just swings back and forth very dramatically. There's some countries in the world that most Americans don't care very much about at all, but for some reason, China excites a lot of passion in US citizens. And in my own lifetime, I've seen that pendulum swing from very negative when I was a child to very positive in the 80s, then negative again after Tiananmen Square, and then positive again throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and now it's swinging back to the negative. So I've seen that pendulum go back and forth. So I tried to end the book on a note of hope, which is a little hard to do when US-China relations are in such bad shape. But John Pomfret, who's one of a journalist that I respect a great deal, who wrote a book about US-China, the history of US-China relations. And he said that both the US and China experience rapturous enchantment, begetting hope, followed by disappointment, repulsion, and disgust. But then they return to fascination once again. So I'm hoping that sometime in my lifetime, there will be a return to fascination once again. So once again, the book is When the Red Gates Opened, a memoir of China's reawakening. It's also now newly available in audiobook. I narrated it myself, and that was kind of a fun experience for a writer to read my book out loud and narrate it as an audiobook. So it's available that way as well. So I'm going to stop share now and go back to Ying and all of you, and very much welcome your questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Dori. Thank you so much for the sharing of your story in China. And so I want to focus a bit on your book, and then we'll move on to larger issues like reflection on the present. Now, what your book's called When the Red Gates Open, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know the word red, right? Now, red evokes some stereotype about China. We call it red China, red communist. So well, how do you come up with the title of the book? You want to share with us?
The title, sure. The title, well, red, as you know, is both a sign of communism, but it's also a color of China. Anybody who's had a red packet knows that red is also a very lucky, good color in China. So it symbolizes China in general. And it was also a time when China had been very closed under Mao, and then it opened up very, very much during the 80s. So it really, in this case, it symbolizes both China and communism, because communism opened up. So I thought it was good that it had both those levels of meaning.
I was very fascinated by the portrayal of China, and then of course Hong Kong in the 80s. You're like a walking history of that period, and it was as you said, it was a transformative period for China, right? Now, what motivates you to write the book now? It's like decades later, and the book is your first personal memoir. So why do it now? And was it difficult to recall all the events from those days?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When I first came back, I was kind of in despair about China, and I was not ready to write about my experiences there at that time. And it took me a while to get to the point where I was ready to write about my own experiences. But another thing that changed is that in recent years, it's now more clear to me what the historical context was. When you're living through a historical time, it feels historical, but you just don't have perspective on it. And I think that now I can look back and really see what was very important, and that I was actually in an amazing place at an amazing time that mattered in history. And also, actually, even being a business correspondent was really at the heart of the action, because it was the economy of China that was transforming most of all. And all these economic reforms I was able to understand and write about, as well as the very earliest times of the US-China business relationship, which of course has become a very big story since then. And so I had a historical perspective myself that allowed me to do that. And then for your question about how to remember things that far back, I was very lucky, because in addition to all the articles I wrote, I have copies of all the articles I wrote. I actually have all of the reporters' notebooks that
Wow.
I took notes in at the time. And I had the appointment calendars. So I could look and see exactly when I had gone to China, which cities I went to, and reconstruct, this article came out after this trip, and kind of reconstruct the parts I really wanted to reconstruct, and see who I met when, which interviews I held. And then also, finally, I had my personal journals, which were totally about my own personal life. So one thing I tried to do is to weave my personal story into it, so it would just seem more real and more concrete, as if somebody was experiencing it with me. And I had those personal journals as well that talked about what was going on inside my head while I was doing all this.
That's amazing. I think that's a inspiration for young journalists or all journalists. Don't throw away your notebooks. Keep a detailed journal of your quotes and who you meet and all of that. Now, but then that was the 80s. Now, you talked about the pendulum, the era of optimism, hope, and then which were brought to a stop in Tiananmen Square in 1989. And then the gates reopened again with Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour, right? Now, quickly, then we are here today, and you're very much aware of this polarization and discontent and disappointment with what's happening in China, right? So what are the lessons for today? What are the lessons from today that we can get from your book?
Well, I think it's really interesting if you look at the 70 years that the Communist Party has been in power. So there were 30 years under Mao, and then there was this era of Deng Xiaoping, and really kind of 30 years under him and his successors. And I really think that Xi Jinping is introducing another era, and we can see some of the outlines of it. We don't have the historical perspective yet on, and we don't know where it's going, really. I mean, we have a sense of where it's going, but we really don't know exactly where it's going. But it does seem like this is another era that's beginning. It's building on the last one. It's not, some people in the US, I see people say, oh, it's going back to Chairman Mao. And I'm like, no, it is not. Of course not. It's a new era, and it's a different era. And I think somebody's going to be writing a good book about this era as well, because things have changed inside China, and that have also changed the US-China relations. And what's going on in Hong Kong, I think, very much is a response to some of the changes under Xi Jinping.
So actually, we do have a question from a viewer. The question is relevant that what we've been talking about. And he or she asks, do you agree that the gap of misunderstanding and ignorance among Americans of China would never be bridged due to ideological prejudice and global rivalries?
I sure hope not. One of my whole kind of goals in life really has been to bridge that divide. And I am hoping that my book, as well as others, eventually will help to bridge that divide. But I take the point of what they're saying, and that is those 2 points that questioner raised are really central questions, central points in the U.S.-China relationship. It's for years, U.S. Viewed China as sort of a younger brother that we were helping along and sending last decade's technology to help them upgrade their ancient factories. And now it's a very different sort of relationship. And it has to be, it's not exactly an equal level, but it has to be much more equal level of, and it is more of a rivalry now, especially since China's pulling ahead of the US in some of these technological areas. And suddenly the US is some people in the US are feeling very much threatened by that. And as far as the ideological differences, I worry a lot about some of the language in among U.S. leaders, particularly Pompeo under Trump. Some of them have really focused on ideological differences And I think that's not terribly helpful. I notice under Biden, there's somewhat less of a focus on that, and more of a focus on realities on the ground and what the areas of cooperation and what the areas of competition are, and to be more. I hope that this administration in the U.S. will be sort of a more realistic and less focused on ideological differences, because there's no way that the United States can change the ideology of the Chinese leaders. And there's no way the Chinese leaders can change the ideology of the American leaders. So those are things I think we need to, even in the worst of the Cold War with Soviet Union, they worked with détente, so really a sense of, here's where we differ, but these are areas where we can either cooperate or have some agreement and work together. And I hope there'll be more of a focus on that in the future.
But then how is détente possible now with the current geopolitical situation? You have two superpowers contending. China is being aggressive in all areas, developing in all areas. And you also have a consensus among the two parties under Donald Trump and also under Biden now, even though President Biden's rhetoric would be toned down. And you have the business, American business is also very worried and negative about China, even though they've been China's most fervent cheerleader. So how can we lower the rhetoric? How's détente possible? How can that bridge be rebuilt?
Well, I hope that it will be. I think one of the things that Biden is focusing on is how to rebuild American industries and invest in American technology. And I think a better way, rather than trying to thwart China, is to try to outsmart China to the degree that that's possible. And I also take issue a little bit with some of the analysis about the two are rivals and they're both, only one can win, and it's going to be kind of a Cold War between the two. Nobody really knows the intentions of the Chinese leaders. We do know what they say and what they've done. And while of course they want to be as advanced as possible and leaders in certain technology, I don't think I really object when a lot of American commentators talk about China's drive for primacy or dominance. And I don't see that China is driving to be the dominant force in the world. You can disagree with me on this, anybody can, but I don't see, I think China wants to have a deterrent. They're tired of having foreigners interfere in their internal affairs and not being strong enough to defend themselves. And so they want to build up a strong military for that. But it's not like the Chinese would attack the US, or they don't have any self-interest in doing that. And I don't think they're trying, and for instance, US has 800 military bases around the world. China has one in Djibouti, and then the rest of them are in Chinese territory, or at least Chinese waters, or at least arguably close to China anyway. There's no way that China will be sending its troops in for regime change in other countries, or doing some of the things that the US has been trying to do over the last 30 years. I don't think China wants to be the world's policeman. I really don't think they want it. They would not be in their self-interest to do that. So I think a lot of the thinking about the rivalry is in my view, is misguided. That's really not what China's all about. Now, you're closer to China, you know more about it than I do, and I'm sure many of your people could disagree with me on that. But I don't see that China's out to dominate the world.
But given the current climate in the United States, would your view such as these be acceptable, be listened to? Or
I don't know. It doesn't seem so at the moment. I can't say that I'm representing a majority of Americans. I think Biden's policy is more pragmatic than Trump's. Trump's was very erratic, as you know, and bumbling, really, and his policy towards China. And I think Biden is going to be more disciplined than that, and is going to try to cooperate when cooperation is possible, and to be more predictable and clearer. And I'm hoping that we're in for a little bit, at least fewer erratic changes than we were before, and maybe a better policy in the future. But I think it's both what's going on in Washington and what's going on in Beijing. I mean, it takes two, and both sides. From what the Chinese leaders say, they don't want a confrontational relationship with the U.S. And there are some people who say, oh, well, you can't trust what they say. And that's not really what they mean, but that is what they say. And they don't want to interfere in other countries, and they're interested in a peaceful rise. And so, and yes, they want the technologies, of course. So I think that I'm hoping that the U.S. will meet them on that same level.
Yeah, we talk about technology, we talk about economic development, but there's an issue of human rights and freedom of expression and all that. And it doesn't seem that President Xi Jinping is willing to give an inch or give anything at all on the issue of Xinjiang and now Hong Kong, in spite of the outpour of international criticisms. So,
right. And I defer to all of you in Hong Kong as people who are much closer to the action and have even a more informed opinion than I do. But from the US perspective, human rights has long been a part of our foreign policy. I think it really dates back to the Holocaust and the fact that we didn't speak up and say anything. And so ever since then, there has been a policy that it's one of several planks, trade and human rights and military and other aspects of international relations. But in reality, there isn't much that the US can do about what goes on inside the borders of another country, of China or Burma or really any other country. And there are also some certain vulnerabilities on human rights in the US as well, which we don't like to talk about because we don't call them human rights violations, but we do have mass incarceration of Blacks and some other things that we do talk about in our free press, but are kind of vulnerabilities of our own. But I think that human rights will continue to be an important part of US foreign policy, but it's unrealistic. Here's the one thing that I would say that is hopeful about that is that China does care very much, it seems, China's leaders, I should say, about its international reputation. And there is some room for leverage in terms of, shaming, which is pretty much what the US has been doing. I think that the sanctions are very limited, what they can realistically do. But China doesn't want to be seen as the bad guy that way. And I'm hoping that they'll be more open on some of these things, but there's not a lot that the US can really do about it.
I'm very encouraged by your optimism. It also means that we need re-engagement in all sectors and at all levels.
I strongly believe in re-engagement. I think if you don't have the sort of the people-to-people and government-to-government connections, and at least be talking to each other about these things, then it's too easy to drift into not just rivalry but enmity. And and if we treat China as an enemy, they're going to start reacting like an enemy. And I don't think that's helpful.
Now we have a question from an audience. China believes that economic freedom does not have to go hand in hand with political freedom. So how would you argue that its system is not superior to America or superior to America? How do you compare those two systems?
It's obvious that China, cares more, or is focused on economic freedom, and that has. I've heard some people in the U.S. say, "Oh, that they're just trying to buy off the people with money," but it's a lot more than that. When you look at the fact that there were so many people in China, remember their grandparents were very poor, and being prosperous is not just being bought off. They really do have a very good life, as you know, many of them. I mean, obviously, there are still people in relative poverty. And we have, my husband has a number of relatives that we've been in touch with over the years, and they live a very good life. They have a condo in Hainan Island, and multiple cars and things like that. But in terms of which system is superior, I really don't think it's helpful to talk about that. I really think that there are different values in different countries. And I'm American, and I have very much American values. We value freedom and democracy very much. But I think inside China, and this is not talking about Hong Kong, there is I remember Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s when he first started talking about Hong Kong's future. What he stressed was stability and prosperity. And I remember at the time just thinking this was some, political talk. But the more I've thought about it, the more I realized that is a very deeply held value inside China, because there was such instability and such poverty in China during the, as recently as the 80s, but for many, many years before that. And during the lifetimes of people who are alive today, they remember times of instability. So, and it also comes out of many years of history. I think if you look at Chinese history for over the many millennia, really, the periods of strong central government have been periods of prosperity, where your son wasn't going to be dragged off to a war, and the armies weren't going to be tearing across your land, and periods of weak central government were periods of terrible deprivation and suffering. So I think that inside China, the sense of having a strong central government is a value that we don't have in the US, because we've never experienced that kind of instability. So I think it's important to realize that the two countries have a different set of values that come from a different history, and that it would help if we would realize that we, with our 250-year history, see things the way we do because we have that history. But many people in China who have a different history have a different understanding of the importance of stability.
But so I suppose for the Chinese authorities here is also how to maintain prosperity while allowing for personal expression and individual freedom. And it's a huge question that we'll have to revisit. Now, back to the book. Okay,
one point on that too is that one thing that really helps, I believe, in as a journalist, very strongly, of course, in freedom of the press and freedom of speech and independent judiciary. And in the US, we call it checks and balances. And one of the problems in China is there are no checks and balances. So when you look out into the future, Xi Jinping is pursuing a policy that's generally good for many of the 1.4 billion, not all, but many people are happy with the policy. But if he were to change, there is nothing in the system that will check that, a move towards something that, and that's how we as Americans see that we would really rather, even though our system doesn't work very well right now, getting to that other questioner's question, we do have these checks and balances, and you have in Hong Kong a judiciary and a press, or you have had that could provide a check and balances. We'll have to see how that works out.
Well, things are changing very quickly in Hong Kong as well, but we'll have to visit that in another conversation. Now, there's a question for you about the Minder, Tiananmen.
Mm-hmm.
You have you kept up with her? What's she doing now?
I have kept up with her. She's retired now. She was married to a Xinhua news reporter. And actually, she and her husband were in Washington at the time of the Tiananmen Square crisis. And he was a Xinhua reporter. So, but they returned to China, and later she was a reporter in Egypt. And then now they're both retired. And the last time we were in China, we had dinner with them, and we get along with them very well and have some very interesting discussions, because they're still very much Communist Party members, and they have their opinions, and we've had some really good discussions with them. And I think it's good to keep communications open.
That's fascinating. In your book, you mentioned when you visited, you brought a box of disposable diapers for her when she just had the baby. Those were the days, right? And now she can buy in the supermarkets, right?
Can you imagine? They didn't have that in China. Well, she and I had babies within 2 months of each other.
That's very sweet of you. Well, we have to wrap up soon. Maybe I'll just have a couple of final questions for you. Say you are going to China again today as a reporter. What would you be looking for? What kind of stories will you do?
Here's what I would be looking for, especially. So there's a recent book that came out called We Are Being Harmonized by Kai Strittmatter, and it's about, and it presents a very negative view of China, as Chinese people, as being very oppressed by surveillance and social credit. And my sense is that most Chinese people that I've talked to don't feel so oppressed, but I don't know that. And I haven't been in China now for more than 2 years. And a lot has changed on that front. And I would really want to know how ordinary Chinese do feel about that. I think at some level, it provides a level of convenience. It certainly helped with controlling the pandemic, and a level of safety, maybe even. But my sense is that obviously some people are oppressed and do feel oppressed, but that the majority of people don't feel that way. But I don't know. And I would really like to know more about how people inside China feel about those issues.
So you'll be like to talk to what we call real people,
Yeah.
Students and public. And how about officials? Who would you ask to do your interview?
Well, I could request Xi Jinping. I'm sure he'd say no. I never did get an interview with Deng Xiaoping, but I'd love to talk to Li Ning again. I think he's retired now, and talk to some of the reformers, economic reformers that I got to know back in the 80s, and ask them how they feel about how things have changed. I think there's a lot of self-censorship in China, the officials will give you the official line, and others who maybe are retired and don't have to might be more careful than they were before. So I'd have to listen with that in mind. If they're outside China, maybe they can talk a little bit more openly. And I'm hoping that we'll start to be able to have Chinese visitors and American visitors to China again. I think that's been one of the problems with US-China relations, is Americans aren't going to China these days, and Chinese aren't coming to America these days. So what level of
Well, we have
understanding.
the internet. We have the internet. Maybe we can Zoom. We can do a WeChat. Actually, there's a final question from an audience who's related to this in terms of understanding and building bridges. We Chinese are learning English hard to help us to understand the United States. Do you think that young Westerners are willing to learn Chinese to understand China? The new generation now.
I think that's a really, really good question, because I know that all across China, there are people now, many people speaking English. When I first went there, of course, there weren't. But it's vital to understanding countries, for the Chinese to understand English-speaking countries throughout the world. And I think that there was a big push in the US for more and more students to learn Chinese, including elementary schools and middle schools. There are quite a number of bilingual schools now, which there never were before, of course. But I worry that especially with this suspicion about the Confucius Institutes, that there will be less and less interest in learning about China. And as relations get worse, that young people will prefer to study another language. And I think that would be very bad. I would really hope that more and more people would speak Chinese. And I would like to speak out to Americans to encourage that. But it's a hard case to make these days.
On that note, I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on the book and your views on the current scene. And let's hope that more communications like this would help the two countries and the two peoples understand each other better. And please, to our audience, please read the book, get the book. I got mine on Kindle, which is very easy. And I look forward to the audio book as well. So thank you very much.
Eager and looking forward to coming back to Hong Kong and seeing you and others of my friends there. So thanks very much.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Hope to see you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks.